Hello everyone, today we talk about Seljuk, askaris and auxiliaries. This is the first video made about Seljuk army organization. We will make another one specifically for the XI-XIII, which is kind of quasi-feudal system that the Seljuks implemented, eventually was used also. We've seen it with the Mamluks in Egypt, etc. Today we look at the role that these forces had. We will be focusing chiefly on Anatolia and Syria, though, because this video is about Crusade. It's from the Crusade series. So other provinces of the Seljuk Empire, that, as you know, was huge, right? The Seljuks never quite controlled everything, actually, since the late 11th century. That this empire was nominal in many ways, and even more so from the end of the 12th, were fragmented completely, so much that actually the Sultanate of Rum was the westernmost, was the largest. At a point, eventually Syria entered in the orbit of the Egyptian Sultanate with the Ayyubids, etc. But the eastern provinces mostly had, political and strategic interests that projected them towards the east. So maybe we'll see it on another occasion. We'll surely talk about those armies as well, but for today we concentrate just on Anatolian Syria. Albeit always realizing, as we will do also today, that Seljuk forces were drawn from an enormous range of territories that could exceed even the boundaries of the same Seljuk Empire that, as you know, stretched from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf, from Anatolia to Afghanistan, etc. So the early Seljuk armies consisted of two major elements, right? The askar of the Sultan. So this was a full-time force, paid either in cash or with the XI-XIII system, that is, with in feudation, right? And it comprised chiefly Mamluk slave soldiers. That were a bit the characteristics of all Muslim armies at this point. We will see how these fighters were properly recruited, which could take many forms besides properly slave trade and enslavement in itself. Always consider also Mamluk. The relation between lords and Mamluks was mostly one of a master with a serf, right? And as you know, the Mamluks came to be actually a privileged class at some point. So it's not properly slavery, albeit at the beginning it surely was, right? Especially in the early times, and it kept being so from all those troops that were properly purchased or conquered from a wide range of areas. But many people would join freely into this relation, and also maintained a larger degree of autonomy in that regard. Then there were the provincial contingents, that were basically like the sultanial ones, right? Just they belonged to the amirs, so the provincial commanders, who had the same structure, askars of their own. Together, however, given the decentralization of the provinces, with increasing amount of auxiliaries, usually supplied by the Turkmens, Bedouins, Kurds, and other tribesmen. So always reflect on the very multicultural nature of such empires, of the complicated, of the Balkanization, could say, of such areas throughout history, and the presence, especially of a civilized world, especially, I don't know, where you could find a statal tradition such as the Abbasid one, with the rich developed areas such as Mesopotamia or Syria, etc. And then all the chiefly this mountainous area make up most of the Mashrek and beyond. Other areas were essentially either still tribal, sometimes still pagan, even from a religious point of view. The same Seljuks at this point were kind of borderline Muslims, right? The elites were naturally Muslim. They were quite eager and zealot about that for reasons of political competition, striving to the top of the Abbasid recognition, etc. But most of them would be pagan still. and or a quasi-feudal reality, such as it happened in Iran. So that we talk about Seljuk Turks, we're speaking of the highly Persified Turkic tribes that had their power mostly revolving around the Iranian plateau, which fitted, that was already feudalized historically, probably not as much as in the West in many ways, but still, retaining this clientelism, but unstable, fluid political asset that characterizes a bit all these powers, essentially from the decline, properly, of the great Islamic civilization towards the 10th century. Right, the 11th century is in many ways a moment of crisis for Islam, a fragmentation. The same crusades, in a way, speak for it, but properly here there is a world taken over by the Seljuks, by these mercenaries, and in general there is the coming apart of the most centralized political realities. However, that doesn't mean that such powers were more or less, powerful necessarily on that base, but surely they contributed even to an increase of militarization in a way, and especially through the injection of all these swarms of fighters coming from Central Asia, from the surrounding regions. So there is an important specification that I should make here, is that when we talk about the askars, which is a term that in Arabic means basically soldier, right, and eventually came here to define the army altogether, right, but it's mostly famous for the Ottoman technical usage that came later, the one of a ruling military caste proper, so that with a proper privilege. That reflects the later developments of, if you want, of the Mamluk system, so that some of these people were freemen, others were servants, but still they had this askari, let's say, status rather than function, because even their families were considered as askars proper. So here we're talking of a different reality where the boundaries were much more blurred in a sense because of the aforementioned variety in the means of employment, also simply the differences in the various lands and their progressed military organization, by the way. And so we can't generalize altogether. But let's say that the askars altogether were this force that could be levied in the various provinces that could range from a few hundred to several thousand, depending on the size of the province. It could be properly overlapping with a city or a broader district. For example, I don't know, Damascus had an askar of 1,000, while Antioch was larger, apparently 2,000, and so on. So as we were saying before, the askars were largely Mamluks. So they were properly slaves, who were bought and had this, this liaison, this connect, this oath, this submission to their warlords, right? That would eventually repay them for their military service. But they could also include freemen, as we were saying before. And in fact, Usama himself, that is a chronicler that we've seen in the Islamic chronicler, the battle videos, for an important, making and giving an important contribution to also Crusader history, served as a paid freeman in the askars of Zengi, of Damascus, of Egypt, and Nur ad-Din, right? So even that naturally increases the quality of his military information, given first-hand experience. And he says that, in fact, also these askaris included Turks, Armenians, Arabs, as well as naturally Turks, but just for saying that this has nothing to do even with religion, right? Everybody could join fundamentally. It was actually compelled to, because if the Amirs were in control of these territories. They controlled the levy, the militias. They had these retinues properly on their own. They either paid or they infeuded locally, right? Organization was, as far as we understand, on a decimal basis. That was a bit the standard for all the Central Asian peoples that the Turks had essentially rendered standard in their armies, right? Albeit it's possible that local troops would be organized differently if, a progressed military organization rendered it more suitable, right? And as you know, however, at this point, even in more sedentary areas, we see mostly mounted armies. The Seljuk armies were basically about that, like all the Turkic ones. And not only, but differently, for example, for more sedentarized areas like Egypt, was much more similar to Western armies in a sense, with a heavy infantry, which a lot of foot, and larger bodies of medium cavalry, etc. Turkic armies had this very narrow but ultra heavy elite of cavalry that was basically usually the sultan's, the emir's household and retinue, and then these swarms, right, of basically unarmored horse archers. And that was their deal, their prerogative. We know it from Crusader battles. They fought basically standardly like that. We can't see the difference with other peoples, also same Muslims, that fought in different ways. And that was a bit their thing. So that speaks in a way for the feudalization, the further spread of mounted combat, of an equestrian military culture in Seljuk armies, in spite of their multicultural character, right? And so much that even the Westerners found so much of of chivalry alternated with naturally that they would respect alternated with bitter hatred from both sides, but in this culture that was importantly based on horse mounted combat, this equestrian culture that properly at this point, with the crisis of the Abbasid Caliphate, with the general, this privatization of warfare, had spread dramatically in the Near East, right? And this is true for many areas. We will see Anatolia also, that was Byzantine, basically sedentarized, fertile, with dams, etc., towns, etc. When the Turks arrived, they took over. Naturally, much was maintained, but for the rest, also much was also transformed. There's a process of desertification, pastures, substituting agriculture, etc., in certain areas. But it's properly this kind of far west, right? That pictures well also this kind of hit and run strategies as well as tactics, actually, in that privileged, naturally, mounted warfare. And there are also some certain proper areas. I mean, because speaking of Anatolia, since the early caliphal period, that was a bit the fringe of the Islamic world in the northwest. So that all the erratics, certain, the most warlike, kind of tribal, less, but yeah, because it was a less developed area, was less urbanized, was more mountainous, etc. Would maintain this higher degree of militarization in a sense, right? Whereas, as we were saying before, Mesopotamia or Syria or Egypt, we were much more civilized and, gentrified even in a way. But the injection of new Mamluks, as we've seen, was a deal that also kind of modified at an ethnical level these cultures in their military customs. In his famous written work, the Siyaset-Nameh, the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk records the Seljuk Sultan's standing army to be as large as 400,000 men. Right, we're talking about the acme of Seljuk power under Malik Shah, around we're talking about 1072, 1092, which all this incredible number of men would be paid through the XI-XIII system, right? So these were properly settled troops. We'll comment in a while about the number in itself, but a courtier in the source is reputed to have advised that this total 400,000 men should be cut back to 70,000 in peacetime, because you can imagine just the cost of this now. Albeit the same, Nizam advocated a further increase in strength to up to a total of 700,000 men. So is it realistic? Well, in terms of, operationally speaking, no, right? That is, nobody could levy but not even in imagine to dream to levy something like even 400,000 men, right? It's impossible. It doesn't find any. There's no any evidence. Nobody at that time could even think to do anything like that. What this number, however, seems to hint at is it's naturally an exaggeration, right? Islamic sources are generally a bit more, a bit less scientific than the Western ones, because it's a matter of, millennia in differences in historiographical tradition. It's not a matter, in the West we had Thucydides or Xenophon. So the rest of the world didn't. Sometimes the same Greeks, indulge in these exaggerations, and forget about the Persian armies, etc. Here it's something different. It's boasting their own strength, which is another approach. And the scale of hundreds of thousands is, however, realistic in the measure in which we consider the sheer amount of fighters that could be levied in theory, right? It could be mobilized, where or another, maybe just for police duty or something that could never be altogether under the control of a sane commander. But considering the sheer amount of Seljuk nominally controlled territories, as we were saying before, something huge, enormous. We're talking about ranges of thousands of kilometers, and inside. So, yes, it is possible that altogether 100,000, 200,000 men could be ideally counted. Surely the Seljuks had the means to approximately calculate such numbers, but this has absolutely nothing to do with the actual capacity of levying these troops, right? And what is interesting in the source is that the courtier suggests to cut these numbers back to from 400,000, 70,000 in peacetime. Why don't we cut 1/10, right, altogether, the properly the numbers? Because what is that these men could actually mobilize under a single command, right? Realistically, not much more than 50,000. And we're talking also about cavalry, so something that logistically you can't really move easily. So altogether, like, you need to move just in certain we will have to talk about the logistics. That is quite well documented, for example, in Mongol times. Tens of thousands of cavalrymen for example, in the dry season. You need just to do it in the humid season, to pass through certain valleys where there is the beverage for the horses, that there is enough food for the forage for them. It's something that it's unrealistic to achieve, and considering the scale of Seljuk operations at this point after the first wave, there's nothing that can correspond to that, right? So here, yeah, it's possible that at the time of Malik Shah, several tens of thousands of troops could be mobilized at all time, right? Because it was basically continuous warfare. These troops naturally lived off the land. They could space from east to west with this capacity. Also, however, with imposing effort, right? So there was a political and a social cost for mobilizing all these troops. Most of them were just raiders, as we will see. So if the prospect of looting had fallen, they would have simply abandoned the army, because there was no control in them, because there were all these tribesmen that joined from knows where, as far as Central Asia, etc., and then eventually going back there, or maybe some, managing to be to be settled through the XI-XIII system. But realistically, we cannot think of anything larger than that for a field army, right? The troops altogether of the Seljuks could mobilize, summing all the provinces, could be, right? But just they would mostly operate locally. So it could even be, yes, in the range of hundreds of thousands, and we should interpret it rather like that. Also, we have to consider that still at the acme of Seljuk power, like the Sultan's army was properly the one that carried out most of the military tasks, meaning that the provincial governors were mostly there to stay, to garrison the place, not also to grow too powerful, because that would threaten the same Seljuk rule, while it's realistic that most of the Seljuk forces would be concentrated under the command of the same Sultan. So much in fact that the royal askar recorded under Malik Shah on one occasion as consisting of 46,000 cavalry is a credible estimate of the largest armies that could be fielded properly under a single command. Right here we would have properly an important corps, maybe of 6,000, let's say, heavier cavalry, plus some tens of thousands of horse archers / raiders, etc., that would create this kind of cloud around the enemy army to pave its road, and also logistically taking over the weakest avampost, and simply using the heavier troops in a pitched battle after having worn out and softened up the enemies. After, like we see in Manzikert, with this astonishing, like the entire day of battle spent just about showering the enemy with arrows, and then just at the very end launching these heavier troops at the charge. We also have perhaps an indicator of the distinct decrease in Seljuk power by the time of Malik Shah's successor's accession. We're talking about the Sultan Barki Yaruk, 1092-1105, whose army counted, according to the sources, the largest at 20,000 men. Which is still imposant for the times being, but still reflecting the gradual disgregation of Seljuk territorial political control. Nizam al-Mulk himself advised the maintenance also of an elite unit, so kind of a guard properly, of 1,000 ashham, right, from amongst the Mamluks of the Sultan. Ashham means, in fact, guard, basically, guards. And that a unit that had should have increased in strength to 5 to 10,000 in wartime. And this is very eloquent, because usually, and this is a bit the story of many corps in this time in history, there was this, and this is even truer, let's say, for this Turkic context, where it would be a first wave of invasion, where most of the troops that had followed you would be settled. In theory, would have to provide military service in return, but wouldn't quite respond because there was no coercive power to control them all. So you could levy them in part because of their own political interest, because maybe they were threatened by the enemy you were going to attack, etc. So they participated. So there was always somebody fighting for you, but with kind of an unreliability. The problem was to find somebody who would remain permanently and professionally in your service, that could be reliable enough as an elite unit that could manifest by itself also your actual political capacity, because if you had the money to pay them, the chances were they probably had some more. At least these troops could with their kind of core strength could support others in looting other areas and profiting like that. So this guards these elite troops of 1,000 asham to rise. In fact, in wartime, from 5 to 10 times more, reveals in part the presence surely of an elite that was required with that function, but also the same fluidity of the same. That is to say, the core even in here is one type. It's like a sub-army, right? That works with the same dynamics basically of the early one. Is this core that plus lots of others that join, right? And that naturally are also joining by privilege. I don't know, the Sultan would accept these people, would take them under his wing, and or it would be a competition to participate to this elite, right? Because all the benefits that they would derive. So it would be even there an effort to provide better troops without really, as an investment for your own future under the Sultan, right? And competing so that the Sultan could take advantage from that and maintain a strength in a world without state, without anything stable practically, that however still worked along these patterns. And what is fascinating is that the Asham guards were composed of Mamluks as well, but they were to be trained specifically, at least ideally, from certain particular milieu: the Dailamis, the Khorasanians, the Georgians, and the young Turkmens. All these areas were a bit at the fringe that civilized world we were talking about before, and therefore they were considered to be tougher stocks and more warlike, kind of more habituated to fighting. The fact that the Turkmens had to be the young ones probably reflects the kind of tribal, what we have talked about even for, I don't know, Indo-European tribes back in the day, the idea that the youth had to participate in these brotherhoods and war bands to go out there to test their military prowess and courage and capacity, and therefore they were fanatic, right? They were people who would kill themselves in order to achieve the glory of the skies and all these things. There was in all this naturally a deep, really, like in all pre-industrial time, a radical religious ideology behind all this, right? In every people here, and the Georgians, for example, weren't even Muslim. But the meaning is that this corps had to be composed by the best of the best, right? The toughest troops from the toughest people, for the most motivated ones, from the ones who were sons of of chieftains, of princes, of lords, of individuals, as we've seen, had all that political interest to make these elements participate at the army. Much later, towards the end of the 13th century, Ibn Bibi Duda records Mamluks in the Sultanate of Rum as being composed chiefly of Byzantine, Cilician, Georgian, and Crimean extraction, the largest number being made of Byzantine Greeks or Cilician Armenians, right? And this is fascinating because naturally the Sultanate of Rome was created, as the name says, properly on Roman territory, and obviously the communities that inhabited Anatolia remain there, right? The Greeks. We actually made a video that talks specifically about this, which is entitled Franks and Byzantines in Seljuk armies, right? We're well documented. We know, even iconographically speaking, from more Western looking armor, etc., kind of heavier troops. This is important because it tells you also that, I don't know, the average Greek inhabitant of Anatolia wouldn't be a nomad, right? These were kind of malicious, like there were, in the West and also in other Muslim countries, as we've seen in Egypt, the most urbanized areas of Syria, of Mesopotamia as well. But it's meaningful. The Armenians also were, as you know, they inhabited the Taurus Mountains. They also also the plains. Think about Tarsus, etc. But they were also considered a tough troop. We made a video on the Armenians during Armenian warriors during the Crusades. You can check that too. There is a whole playlist about Crusader warfare, and we don't have, in general, we don't have to be too dogmatic here about any kind of distinction. The Mamluk who captured the Byzantine Emperor Romanus IV at Manzikert was a Byzantine. Right, he was a Greek turncoat. And this is interesting because it tells you how, it was business, right? War, as it's always been, and legitimately so. And it tells you how varied such in compositions such armies really were. Right, and always remember the autonomous element in here. there is a sultanial or Amir corps that is flanked by swarms of people who come from literally everywhere, can be thousands of kilometers away, that just by knowing that somebody was about to wage war, which is something that everybody knows, months before, right? It's not something that happens all of a sudden. Large-scale operations are prepared, takes a logistical effort. Merchants, travels, they're the ones to provide the subcontracted things, travel, news spread, etc. These people would run and participate to loot. Then it would, at the end of that, okay, is it over? Okay, come back home with the slaves and all. This is in practice what it was like. Together with the Turks, also many Kurds, for example, settled in Anatolia after Manzikert. Right, the Byzantines were already trying to stamp from the eastern frontier because there was no real border. Right, it's more a frontier altogether. All these troops, all these askars were normally either war slaves. They were also purchased, or they could be diplomatic gifts. What would emirs, interact like international? I'll send you a bunch of Mamluks, right? And it was all, even in here, a quality, right? A competition, an ostentation. Well, who has the best troops? Or, however, these askaris, as we've seen, were also freemen, and they could be levied within the Seljuk state itself. After the death of Malik Shah in 1092, and as we've seen, the subsequent disintegration of there had ever been a centralized Seljuk power, understandably enough, the provincial armies took over. So the provincial askars and the various auxiliaries under the control of the various emirs assumed the leading role as these lands became practically and then totally independent. There was kind of an idea that, yes, there was a Seljuk bloodline that lived on a bit. It was like, I don't know, I can't say like the Kievan Rus, but it's something similar, right? That there was properly an imperial universalistic obsession. Of course, the Seljuks were in their own regard, the conquerors of the world, right? So the celestial glory has shone upon them. They had received this from God, so their lineage was privileged, and therefore that the royalty was theirs, the rule, command, etc. So, namely, that remained as a way of the elites of all these various provinces to maintain a kind of self-legitimization. It's like a bit like in Western feudalism, right? Albeit that was a bit more secularized in thought already, but still the idea is that there is a military class that here, a ruling one as well, that recognizes itself as being part of having had a common origin, right, shared background, and therefore managing to use that as a political weapon to curb the ambitions of other individuals to rise, other lords to rise to power in their stead, etc. This didn't work more than much at the end of the day, but it was still something, right? And only in the mid-12th century, under Nur ad-Din, so following in the footsteps of his father Zengi, Syrian provinces were reunited by force. And Nur ad-Din also added Egypt to his domains in 1169. This, as you know, set the stage for the rise of Salah ad-Din, that was made governor of Egypt, and then eventually, became Sultan and managed to take control also the Syrian provinces, etc. So there was eventually those lands would remain under Egyptian control also after the Ayyubids with properly the Mamluk dynasty, and things changed a little bit, not more than much in terms of military organization or military culture altogether, also because the Ayyubids here were coming technically from the same bit of a more of a Kurdish rather than a Turkic background, but still basically soaked in that kind of Persified Turkic military culture of the great Seljuk Empire, right? So before these events, the Syrian, the command of Syrian provincial armies was usually in the hands of the most powerful emirs, as you know, usually the emir of Mosul, but the thing varied, right? Because the situation was unstable enough, and there wasn't much of a cooperation because all these emirs were competing against each other as much as they did with surrounding powers. Famously enough, they were, some were allies with crusaders that would help them gaining more or less power, whatever, and vice versa, by the way. So this isn't kind of a good recipe for unity in Syrian armies that, however, were mobilized all together at some point. It's like a bit in, the same Crusader states are an example of that, feudalism, with all its decentralization and nuisances deriving from it. It's very difficult to have a cohesive unity of command. And so they would, of course, do the worst things against each other at the detriment of the broader enterprise, because naturally every military operation, if successful or unsuccessful, would have provided, would have empowered or weakened a certain specific emirs, so who had to gain or lose from it would act accordingly. And this was altogether also maybe a bit of Islam is a bit distrustful towards any form of terrestrial power, but these realities we've seen had mostly a properly Turkic background, which was more, I can't say more secular, but more pagan, right? And it's the military cultures of Central Asia that, generally speaking, yes, have an idea of overlordship, and the very serious one of the oceanic rulers of the world, conquerors of the world, but still, the society is very unstable. This was not Central Asia, but still that political mindset and culture and kind of arrogance. I've seen a very similar sense of themselves like Western nobility had, arrogant, individualistic minded, and charismatic. So there was a typical trait there that would cause also this dissent among the joint command. And this also affected the Syrian strategy in the time of mobilization, because Syria is not, it's large, but it's not a huge country. So, but it could take months sometimes to muster an army that would be still easily bribed sometimes to either participate or not, to continue and discontinue the present and support of the various emirs, right? So these is quite eloquent. Anyhow, speaking of the mass of askars and auxiliaries all together, both the Rumis of the Anatolian Turks and the Syrian Seljuks relied heavily on Turkmen tribesmen, who, as we've seen before, were fierce, more warlike, more tribal, less civilized, but for this very reason also less reliable troops, right? They had this fresh, genuine force that would be best spent to raid, pillage, lay waste, basically enemy territory, but you couldn't really go tell them, like, do this or that, because they were there for the loot in the first place, and they weren't even the most important asset of the army. Like, you have to imagine a Seljuk commander being mostly concerned about letting that core of heavier troops to even provide with to even hope to receive some support of credibility for military operations, for those other auxiliaries to join. But altogether, the Turkmens also were a bit necessary for the same Seljuk military strength throughout our world period, because without these swarms of lighter cavalry, the strategical, logistical problems would have been much higher, right? So the Turkmens didn't readily accept any form of authority or discipline. They were disciplined as much as enough, let's say, for what they're simply, these people were grown old on horseback in raiding warfare, so that's what they knew to do, standard packed ability. For the rest, they were just in for the plunder, and if none of it was forthcoming, they were likely to abandon the army altogether. And how could you control these troops? Right, you can't. Even maintaining discipline in a medieval army is a big deal because of the composite nature of these armies themselves, right? And usually they wouldn't be even paid for this. That's why they were convenient, right? Because while the core heavier army of the Sultan or the Emir were local troops, so they also came from a political and social background that the Sultan had to cope with and to implement and to favor, to develop every day that he would find at home. These guys were properly not to be like they would simply join, right? You didn't have to pay for them, right? Their pay was essentially ransom money taken in exchange for high-ranking prisoners by their employer. So big deal, because you don't have to provide for their logistics. They would think all about themselves. These people were able to survive into the wilderness, and the campaigning in the civilized world was already, just a vacation for that way. Looting everything they found, and it was their paradise. And literally, that's also what in their Islamic gradual passage from pagan and Islamic mentality, naturally, the deal was like just for the Crusaders having with salvation and heavenly reward. And the Turkmens themselves suffered innerly also indiscipline, right, among the various chieftains, so that because of their quarrels, sometimes they wouldn't even cash match, because they sometimes exterminated their prisoners, so depriving themselves in practice of their own pay. At other times, however, some chieftains were paid by the Seljuks. Some were settled properly with the XI-XIII system, albeit in their case was mostly not a real sedentarization, but mostly the grant of some grazing lands over a very large amount of territory, which emerges from the areas that are named by the sources, where such nomadic herdsmen could essentially settle for a while, that it could, the passage of which could exploit, maybe properly as a logistical base to intervene more readily in favor of the Sultan. That, in that sense, was making them a favor to which they would respond, because he had allowed to settle them. And obviously, the situation being always very ambiguous and difficult to measure. But still, this was a way for Seljuk powers to supply important amounts of troops, as we've seen. And modern estimates recount that Turkmen strength in Anatolia by the late 11th century was around 30,000 men. Jan Heath here thinks that this measure is too low. I don't think so. I mean, 30,000 men, here we're talking about the 11th century, right? These steppe peoples were many, but let's not exaggerate. 30,000 men is already a big deal, demographically speaking. And in Anatolia there were also other people, so it wasn't just like a complete Far West. So 30,000 is realistic, and I don't think much more is otherwise. Frankish chroniclers knew how to exaggerate in terms of numbers too, right? They stated that during the First Crusade, the Sultan of Rome, Kilich Arslan I, mustered something between 200,000, 360,000 cavalry, which is also realistic. Probably was something between 20,000, 30,000, right? Which is a lot. And surely the majority of them was turkmens, this light armored, if not actually unarmored, horse archers. And that the Crusaders knew very well because of the hail of arrows they were constantly under. We know also that other areas such as the Jazira, so basically the upper northern Mesopotamia, by the early 12th century could raise something between 20 and 50,000 Turkmens. I would say it's realistic, even in here, or something in between, probably, I don't know, 35,000. It's 30,000, it's realistic. Remember, these people were not all properly settled there. They came from the surroundings as well, so it's surely accurate. And if you add to that some thousand heavier troops, there you have a standard Seljuk field army for the grand campaigns at the time. So mostly the largest forces that by those times, even considering the neighbors like the Byzantines or the Crusaders, whoever could normally field. Then there were other ethnic groups that provided auxiliary forces for the Seljuks, such as the Bedouins of Arabia. So we are, importantly documented about that from the southern deserts. These guys would sit like since ever, right? Since the same Islamic invasions started like that. These nomads living at the outskirts of the civilized world, pretty warlike, selling their services to the richer civilized sedentary powers of the north. The Kurds from the north, the Kurds, they were hill people from the mountainous districts of roughly northwestern Iran. Marco Polo registered, quote, they were quote, lusty fighters and lawless men, very fond of robbing merchants, because those areas were important tradeways, and also important strategic areas that were through, the Tigris valleys, for example. The Byzantine would pass to try to invade Mesopotamia back before still Manzikar's times. That also where the Seljuks passed for their operations. And so, like, this tough stocks of mountaineers that weren't much of a power by themselves, but, try in the 11th or 12th century to dislodge this man from the mountains. It's madness, right? And so that's what they do. They're very tough infantries, skirmishers, etc. They often featured in Seljuk armies themselves. As many as 10,000 are recorded at the Battle of Manzikert. But just like the Turkmens, they didn't have much of a discipline or organization. They fought principally for loot themselves. They didn't have much of an efficient logistics. They were easily, disheartened by a long or unsuccessful campaign. So all what you imagine from stateless people, but without state, you don't have much of a military quality, discipline, training, logistical capacity, right? And Kurds were particularly prominent in the armies of Nur ad-Din. Right, they surely had cavalry, right? They were all the Ayyubids who had this Kurdic background in their forces. But no, Saladin employed them. Other Zengid, Ortukid, and Ayyubid princes employed Kurdish auxiliaries and paid askaris on a regular base. By the 13th century, in the Sultanate of Rome, we find other nationalities, such as Persian, Arab, or even Russian, which speaks for the widening of the world's horizons and frontiers by the rich 13th century. There's the peak of medieval civilization with fluidification of trade routes, monetization of power. So there were people simply traveling more far to go to serve as mercenaries, right? Persians, Arabs, Russians. And consider that many Mamluks were often taken north of the Caucasus. As we were saying before, remember the Sultanate of Rum, as early times, had Crimeans participating. So also some Slavs actually joined these. Many Mamluks, even later on, I don't know, during the Mamluk Egypt, were Slavs themselves, right? Ethnically. Naturally, being a Mamluk also would be increasingly being a bit like the Janissaries, being indoctrinated into the Islamic faith and the obedience to because the Mamluk had to be the obedient, the embodiment of loyalty to his master, right? So there was all this, and this is very, very Islamic in nature, the idea of subjection and the subjugation of, to the ruler that had naturally to embody, in a way, the divine will, at least, in the political and social hierarchy. We made a video on the Battle of Iran in 1104. There was a Syrian army that we counted roughly in 10,000 men as auxiliary force, of which 7,000 were Turkmens, and the remaining 3,000 included instead Bedouins, Kurds, as well as Seljuks themselves. All right, so this was properly it, and then as we were saying before, we will talk about the XI-XIII at some point. I don't remember whether we already made a video on the Sultanate of Rum military organization. I don't think so, but we definitely will, especially for the later period of the 13th century. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.